You just caught me container gardening. Thanks for joining me. I'm your host, Carrie, and like I said, today we are talking about container gardening. So we are outside of our office at Columbia's Agriculture Park, where you can see we have a lot of containers that are decorating the entrance to our temporary office. Now, a lot of people use containers to grow flowers or bedding plants, but we encourage you to also grow some specific types of vegetables in them as well, because you can get a little bit to snack on, and it's a fun way and more manageable way to slowly work your way into the hobby of gardening if you're not certain you have the space or the time to jump full force into a large garden. In today's video, we'll go over what kinds of containers and soil mix work for specific plants to grow well in containers. We'll talk about matching the size of the containers to different plants or planting groups. And we'll talk about what edible plants work well in containers, and also how to care for them after you've planted them up. So there's a whole world of different pots you can use, all the way from small stock tanks like right here to large terracotta pots or smaller terracotta pots, plastic pots, or glazed terracotta pots like over here. You can also have styrofoam pots. You can use 5-gallon buckets. You can use crates. Really, you know, the world is your oyster as far as what you can grow food in. The main thing you want to make certain of is that you have drainage in whatever you use to grow your food crops. If you grow things that you are perennial, so that they grow over the winter and come back the next growing season, you do want to make sure that the pot you use or the container you use is frost proof. Not all terracotta pots are frost proof, so you just want to make sure of that before you purchase it, if you're purchasing anything. Also, another thing you want to think of before, kind of just like planting pots full of vegetables, is think about what the end size of the plant will be. So for example, you might get a tomato plant from a nursery that is this big, and you might think, oh, this size pot will be adorable for that tomato. But tomatoes get really big. They get several feet tall. So this is maybe the smallest size container you want. You really want it in something even larger, something like the small stock tank. So think about what the ultimate size of the plant is going to be and match it to the size of the container. This is a young Swiss chard plant, so right now it looks really tiny in this big pot, but it also gets pretty large. It can grow to be 18 inches tall and a foot wide. So I want to give it a lot of space, both for its roots and for its above ground parts. Another thing you want to consider as you're planting your containers is the spacing for the plants. A lot of times people are really excited to put plants in pots and have groupings of plants, so they plant them a little bit closer, and then the plants are struggling with each other for space and light and nutrients, and they can be kind of weak and spindly. So you want to be sure that you're still planting them at the right spacing for them to be nice and full and mature looking plants. Potting mix is the best thing to fill your containers with. So these are all filled with just general, all-purpose potting mix that you can get at any gardening center or hardware store. These larger ones, like these stock tanks, you can fill with topsoil and compost, since that's more economical than just potting mix for something that's this large. I wouldn't recommend just using topsoil that you dig out of your garden. It's a little too heavy. So making sure that if you do purchase topsoil for here, also mix it with compost or something that allows for air space. Another thing about containers is that you will probably have to fertilize them more and also water them more than your in-ground garden plants, because they're in little tiny environments. The root environments are in just a couple cubic feet versus, an entire backyard. So even though like the potting mixes come with fertilizers in them, just know as the season progresses and your plants take all that nutrition up, that you might start seeing yellowing later in the summer, which is an indication to you to start fertilizing them. So what kind of plants do really well in containers? So we have kind of a list of, through trial and error, we have decided work really well for us here in Central Missouri to grow in containers. Fruits like eggplants do really well in containers, and actually arguably do better in containers than they do in in-ground gardens. And that is because they are susceptible to an insect called a flea beetle. And a flea beetle is like this really tiny little beetle, and it jumps really, really far for how big it is. But they, even though they're so small, they can destroy an entire eggplant, so much so that it dies and you never get any of the fruit. Now, if you plant an eggplant in a container like this size, or one of these small stock tanks, or like in a crate or a 5-gallon bucket with holes drilled into it, the flea beetles can't jump that high. So the flea beetles can never, like get to your plants. So it actually protects them and lets them grow and thrive without that pest in their life. Other things that do really well in containers are herbs. Herbs like mint right here. Mint would grow well anywhere, to be honest. It's a very pervasive plant, which is why it grows really well and why we recommend people to grow it in containers so that you can contain it in your garden so that it doesn't spread all over the place. Other things in the mint family like lemon balm are also great things to plant in containers just to keep them, you know, to one space in your garden. Other herbs like rosemary and lavender that aren't reliably hardy in our winters but are perennials, you can plant in large containers and bring them into an unheated garage or like a large shed or something over the winter to try to keep them nice and happy in a covered space over the winter and bring them out the following garden season. Whereas they might not live throughout the winter planted in directly in the soil in your garden. Celery over here is one of my favorite things to grow in containers because celery doesn't really do well here in our like climate. It's too hot or it's too wet or it's too sunny. It just doesn't like growing here. But you can grow it in a pot and put it under a tree where it gets some dappled shade throughout the day, and it does perfectly. Whereas in a garden setting where you get full sun, it's just too much and it gets bitter and you don't like it. But in a pot under a tree with a high canopy, it does fabulous every year. And then cut and come again greens like Swiss chard, kale, do really well in containers because you can harvest them slowly throughout the gardening season, so you're getting a constant supply of these greens, and they're nice and attractive plants, so it's kind of like a twofer. You get a lot of food and they're beautiful. Not all plants work well for containers, so some things in our experience that don't work well for containers are like summer squash, small pumpkins, winter squash, and that is because they have really shallow and widespread root systems. So even a large container like this one, or even one such as this one, doesn't give it enough space for its roots to grow like they would want to. Another one that doesn't do super well is okra. Now okra grows really well in a container, but how okra grows is you need a whole bunch of okra plants to get a good amount of okra. So if you like how okra looks, it is a beautiful plant. It's got lovely flowers that look like hibiscuses. You can certainly do it and have a lot of success, but if you want to grow okra so that you can eat okra, you should grow it in the ground in your garden, because and multiple plants, because that's the only way you'll get a good steady flow of okra. So once you've planted your container garden and you have it out on display for all your friends to compliment you on, how are you going to take care of it? Well, like I said, containers require a lot more water than an in-ground garden, and that's because a lot of the containers, such as this terracotta pot, are breathable. So that means that the wind blows through the container, so that you have to water it much more frequently than you would an in-ground garden bed. So oftentimes I check the container with my finger to see if it's dry, to my middle knuckle, and this one actually is. I should probably go water this one. And you might, in the summertime, you might have to water these containers every single day, which is more frequently than you would probably water your in-ground garden. Also adding some fertilizer as the season wears on, just because they're in a smaller volume of potting mix with a finite amount of nutrients that they're going to take up really quickly. So keep an eye out on needing to fertilize them. Also, because they are above the ground in a small quantity of soil, they tend to get overheated. So as the summertime rolls around and this is in direct sun all the time, I might need to move these to a shadier location so that the roots don't get so hot. This container has some perennial herbs in it. I've got some thyme, which lives multiple years, and then I've got a biennial, which is this parsley, which lives 2 years. So this container, because it's got this thyme in it, I don't want the roots of the thyme plant to freeze in the wintertime. So I bring this into an unheated garage over the winter time, and then I bring it back out in the spring and plant some things around it. So you might have to winterize some of your containers if you have perennials growing in them. Container gardening is a nice and easy way to get started with a gardening hobby. It doesn't take a lot of time and it doesn't take a lot of space. And you can grow a small amount of your food in a really small confined space, which is really nice. If you are new to gardening and are really not sure if you're be into the hobby, I would really recommend that you try container gardening because it doesn't take a lot of time and you can see if you're into it and maybe want to expand later on. So with that, thanks for joining me today and I'll see you next time. Bye.